Hi, I'm Lauren Selden, and today I'm going to show how to create a tension fit tiny little metal container. The main purpose of this container is so that we can learn different methods of soldering and different joinery. So we are going to do a butt joint for the outside edge. We're going to do a right angle joint for where it connects to the bottom. And then we're also going to get to do a sweat soldered joint for the top. So stick with me. We're going to try to make this little guy. So this is a piece of 18 gauge brass, which will be the outside of my container. So my first step is that I need to anneal. With brass, if I needed a little help with annealing, I could put a little dot of flux on the edge, and that would give me an idea of when it's glassy, that's at the annealing temperature. Other than that, I still go through that rainbow color, and then it's all kind of the same color of gray. And then you can see that my torch, right off the end of my torch, there's a little bit of orange, and that is where I have that annealing temperature. It's going to be important to anneal the material so that the metal is softened, so that then I can form it. And then I'll just quench in water, and then I'll put it in the pickle to clean. So I have the annealed brass piece, and my next stage is that I need to form it. It's a good idea to make sure that the outside edge is really flat, so I often take a crosscut file, and I usually would do this at my bench just to make sure it's nice and straight. But I just want to make sure that that edge is straight, because the shear does pinch the two edges. So if you want a seamless joint, you really want to file. You can also use a sanding board as long as you can keep your material perpendicular. So that looks good. And that looks good. I just want to see the exact same plane on both sides. Have it nice and straight. So I'm going to start with this stake over here. You could also use a mandrel. And I'm going to start forming here. And I'm going to try this technique where we use a wooden stake to form against. And so I'm going to do things a little bit different on this one. I'm basically just going to form the edges first. I'm still going to use the round side so that I don't fully dent the opposite side. And I'm just kind of rounding the material that way. And then I'm rounding the material that way. And then I do like to go on the straight side, and without, letting this edge cut into the bottom, just hammering down to make sure that that's nice and flat. So there's my two sides, they're ready to go. So the next stage, I'm going to put my mandrel into over this depression, and I'm going to start to form the piece. And so I'm hitting the actual mandrel. And this wooden stake was made for making rings, so the depressions are a little bit bigger, or smaller. But you can certainly groove out shapes into some hardwood, any kind of shape you want. But you can see here that I've almost already fully formed it. So this is kind of using the mandrel and the depression and the wood to form the material. But you could certainly form it all the way around the mandrel as well. With tapered mandrels, it's often hard to do the forming because you end up doing what I just did there, where it kind of where it's starting to twist the material, and that's due to the taper. That's due to the taper in the material, or in the mandrel. So I usually can kind of reform that while I'm on my steak. And I can also go kind of right off the edge of the stump. And just kind of hammer back on the side that was twisted. So this one, because of the gauge, I can actually switch to just working with my hands. I'm just straightening that joint out. And you want to hear that little pop. I kind of went I went up above and below, and I'm trying to get this edge here to be perfectly straight, which it is. Try to avoid, you know, rubbing the joint with your fingers, because I do want to go and solder right after this, so I don't want any oil on that joint. So this one is ready for a butt joint. So the next stage, if I really was doing a lot of hammering on this, you know, to get the joint, I could anneal it and pickle it first. But the next stage, I'm ready to solder. So I'm going to flux both sides of the joint there. And then I'm going to use hard solder. This is our first solder joint, so we're going to use hard solder. It's melting at 1425 degrees. I want to have hard first so that if I need to switch to medium or easy solder, I will still have the opportunity to do so. You can stick with hard solder for quite a while, because the previous hard solder joint maintains just a second longer each time. So you can really stick to hard solder, but you've just got to watch where your torch is so that you don't overheat a previous joint. So I've put the pallions of solder on there. I'm going to use gravity to work for me as well. So sometimes since this is really round, I formed it really round, I can take little bitty pumice stones and hold it up. I don't want to add, you know, any steel tools, because the steel would end up being a heat sink. It would take heat away from my piece. And I do need my whole piece to be the same heat for the solder to flow. Okay, so I'm ready to solder. So I'm going to preheat. I'm going to go around, and then I'm going to go into the form, and then you'll be able to see the solder from the top joint. The entire piece needs to be the same heat for the solder to flow. And I'm using a number 2 torch tip. And so I'll start my preheat. The preheat is just helping get the water and the flux to burn off, so that those solder pallions don't go flying everywhere. Just in case they do, I have a solder poker waiting so that I can push them with heat. So now I'm basically preheating. You can see it bubbling just a little bit there. And now my flux is starting to get pretty white, so that water is burning off. When you use your solder poker, you do have to use heat to move. So I'm going to get the inside really, really hot, because there's a lot of sheet metal there. And then I can start to get the sides hot. You can still use the rotary, and I just always touch at the very bottom of it and make sure that you're not accidentally heating your rotary so that you don't burn that left hand. So now everything's really nice and hot. I'm actually staying way away from my joint, because I want everything to be the same temperature for that solder to flow down towards the heat. So this one's getting ready. Flux is glassy. I'm going to reheat the sides one more time. Once that flux starts to get really mirror shaped, it's ready to go. And there's my good solder joint. If I wanted to, and if I had time and it was clean, I can knock the form over, and I can pull. I usually heat the opposite side again, get it nice and hot again, and I can pull the solder through from this angle. You might not have the time for that if it got too dirty. So there it is. This is brass, so I do want to give it just a second before I quench it so that I don't create future fractures. So I give it a second, and then I'm going to quench in water, and then put it in the pickle to clean. Baking soda and water outside of the pickle, and then clean it up, and we'll be ready for the next stage. So I have my brass tube out of the pickle and cleaned it with a little bit of pumice and water, and now I just need to form it into a rounder cylinder. So my original ring mandrel is going to be too small for this, and so we happen to have specialty mandrels, and it could be that you form over the stake, or you might even have to form over a smaller part of a mandrel and keep hitting on that one spot. We have this larger ring mandrel that goes up to size 24, and that one works just awesome for what we need. And so I'm going to start the forming process. So I'm right-handed. My hammer is going to fall off of the right side, and my left hand is going to start to turn to the left. So both arms are going kind of to the outside. And for now, I'm concentrating my blows on the side that is closest to me. So that's the side that is the thickest part of the mandrel. And that's so that I don't taper the form. So my hammer is a rawhide hammer with no weight in it, no lead in it. I'm just forming that. And then as all forming, I want to take it off, flip it around, and then you see that I'm even pushing it down with my hands. And I'm still letting the mandrel vibrate a little bit on the stump. And that's looking really good. I'll go one more time, all the way around, overlapping blows. And then we're going to be ready to put a bottom on it. So I'll grab 2 of the cotter pins, use the ones that are the same dimension, because that's the whole point of doing it. It gives just an even flow of heat. And most metalsmiths will probably remember that Fred Finster is one of the main people that kind of taught all of us to use cotter pins. So if you ever run into Fred, he is probably your teacher here. I fluxed this really well. I have sanded this on a sanding board, so it is really, really flat. And there's no little ridges, and everything is clean. I'm going to put it here, and then I'm going to put pallions of solder all the way around it, and then I'll be ready to solder. So I have my solder placed all the way around the base. The idea is you put the solder on the outside edge, and then you can add heat to the inside, but all of this is going to conduct heat to the inside. So you want to kind of have the solder flow through the wall instead of putting your pallions on the inside, because then they'll just kind of collect straight to the middle of the metal. So asking the solder to run through the wall is using that capillary action where it's gonna flood to where the heat is. So that's the place that you want to put it. There's about a millimeter of space in between each of those pallions of solder. I still used hard solder because I will be able to see that joint really well, and I can certainly avoid overheating it. Still using a number 2 torch tip, but I might have another torch sitting around just in case if I need it. So I'll still preheat. And again, I'm using that rotary. And now I'm starting to really aggressively heat my piece, because I do want to get it hot enough, fast enough, so that solder can flow before the piece gets too dirty. I'm going to heat the inside really, really well. And then I can use those cotter pins, and now I'm reflecting heat underneath. And that's why it's nice to have those under there. I'll heat the inside really well. Heat the top of the tube. Make sure it's nice and hot. And then go ahead and take a watch at that joint. That solder is really ready to flow. So I can go at the exact angle that I want it to flow. And go back from the inside. And just getting the last of this to flow. There you can see it going. There you can see it. That bottom sheet's getting a lot of extra heat so that I ask it to go down instead of up the tube. Those first pallions started to go up the tube, and I could just tell that the bottom piece wasn't as hot as it needed to be. And then when I look through the center, I should be able to see a beautiful silver line of solder all the way down so that I know that this can be a watertight vessel. And go back onto the outside, and then there it is. Wait a second, because that's really nice and hot, and then we're going to quench it, put it in the pickle. So this is the part that is going to require a little bit of math. I have my cylinder and I have it connected to a base. And so what I want to find is I want to find the inner diameter of this wall so that I can make a ring that is going to slide into it. So I'm going to measure using millimeters because it's going to be more precise for what I need. And I measure my diameter, and for this diameter it's 29 millimeters. So I'm going to take 29 millimeters times 3.14, which is going to be for getting the circumference, and then I am going to subtract 3 times the thickness of the metal. So I'm using 18 gauge, which is roughly a millimeter thick. So I'm just going to subtract 3 millimeters. And that's because the material has thickness. If I made it exactly 29 times 3.14, it's just going to be 3 times the thickness of metal, a little bit too big. Now, metal stretches really easily at this thickness whenever I'm making the ring. So I would actually cheat on this one even a little bit more. So even if you subtract 4 millimeters, then you can kind of stretch your ring to be the right size. So I usually cheat a little bit, especially if you're using copper, because it's going to stretch a lot. With the brass, it's not going to stretch as bad, but it still will want to. So diameter times 3.14 minus 3 times the thickness of your metal. So you already knew multiple ways to form the ring, so you form the ring. I'm going to set this up a little bit differently with soldering just so that you can see different ways to do it. And I'm just going to pick this up with the solder that is sitting right here up with my solder poker to just show you another way of putting solder on. So I'm still going to preheat. And that flux is already, the water's starting to burn off. So I'll pick these up with heat and then attach them to my ring. Sometimes they like to move around a little bit. I can also flip it over and pull that solder through to just make sure it went through the whole joint. So I'm now ready to solder the lid to the tension fit ring. So I have flux and then I have hard solder around again because this isn't under too much tension and I know I can avoid that previous hard solder joint. Still with a number 2 Smith torch tip, and I have it up on cotter pins so that heat can reflect. And the solder pallions are on the outside of the ring again so that I can draw the solder in using capillary action. I'm using paste flux, and so that's why these solder pallions have the ability to kind of move with that water that's in the paste flux. I'm gonna heat really nice and hot on the bottom, and then I'm gonna angle some heat underneath, asking that brick to kind of heat it really well. Those cotter pins are holding it up so that there's plenty of heat underneath the sheet, because it will want to go up the side wall. I'm still heating the bottom sheet. I can move my heat back into the inside of the ring. And then I've got all that heat on the bottom sheet, because the ring is going to be hot no matter what. So if I angle my torch up, it's going to want to just pull the solder up the ring. And so now the solder's ready to flow, and you can see that I have my torch at the angle that I want the solder to flow, which is down, and there's just a beautiful joint. And so that part is done as well. Pickle it and move on. So I just soldered my lid. I will pickle it soon. I just couldn't wait. I had to check and make sure that it fit. So here's my base, and here's the top. And it looks like it's just gonna be great. And so I still have some room to file if I need to. And then obviously I will cut off the bottom. So I'll cut off the bottom of this one first, and then I cut this one second, and make sure that I leave a little edge so that the sheet metal goes all the way to the edge. And so then I will file the whole barrel to get that shape the way that I want it. So it's a really good, nice, tight fit.